Hey friends, Adam Hamilton here, Senior Pastor at the United Methodist Church of the Resurrection. Welcome to Tuesday Night Vespers. I'm so glad that you're joining me tonight. Now, you all are in real time, and I have had to record this just a little bit early because we have a conflict tonight. We have our all-church conference at Church of the Resurrection, and I couldn't be in two places at once. I was trying to finagle it to work it out so I could, but I just could not make sure that I was going to be here for the beginning of Vespers. So I'm recording this just a little bit earlier, just a couple of hours earlier, and it's playing back today. And so anyway, please let me know that you're here. So I'm going to go back and read all the comments afterwards, but tell me know you're here. Let me know you're here. Let me know where you're coming from. And then anytime you want to comment about anything that I've said, feel free to do that. I don't always get to respond to the comments. There's hundreds of comments usually, but I do read them all, and I really appreciate that. And I'm so glad to have a chance to be with you today, and I'm looking forward to our two topics today. We're going to pick up where we left off last week for Vespers, and we're going to talk about cremation. So we're going to start there, and we're going to spend a few minutes talking about cremation. And then I'm literally just taking the questions that you asked, many of you asked, on a survey that we did a few months ago, actually a few weeks ago, it was about 7 weeks ago. We did a survey on doubt, and we asked people to write, to both answer questions, and so we found what the top doubts were and the top questions were that elicited doubt. And we're covering those in the sermons on Sunday. And then there was an open-ended question where you could post your, any other questions you had or any other comments or thoughts you had. I think we had 768 comments posted there, and we broke those down into the various categories that tie into the sermons. And so today I'm going to literally just take the questions that you asked about unanswered prayer, and I'm going to try to answer as many of those as I can. I've kind of grouped them together in categories because there was, I think, 60 questions, and so I'm going to answer as many of those as I can get to in our time together. So anyhow, I want to begin, however, with a word of prayer. Would you bow with me in prayer? God, I thank you for all these who are joining me for Vespers tonight, and I pray your blessings upon them. Holy Spirit, I pray that you would speak to their hearts, that you would encourage them, strengthen them, guide them, lead them. Open our ears to hear and our hearts to receive all that we have for you. And I pray for me, Lord. I feel a little tired and weary without much sleep last night, and so I pray that you would just help me to disappear and people would hear from you what you would want to say to them. And so guide us in this conversation tonight. Bless our time together this evening. In Jesus' name, amen. Last night I had one of those nights where I went to bed about 1:30. I was working on the sermon for this weekend and several other things I was trying to get done. And so went to bed about 1:30. And at 5 o'clock, I was wide awake in bed, and I just laid there, and I have my alarm clock projects the time up onto the ceiling, so I look up every little bit, and I laid there and I prayed, and I spent time thinking about the sermon and other things, and so anyway, I'm running on about 3.5 hours sleep right now, so hopefully some of this will make sense, and I hope it'll be a blessing to you. And again, tonight we're having our all-church conference. I want to tell you something about our all-church conference. I know not all of you go to Resurrection, but what we do in the United Methodist Church is we have a gathering once a year, usually once a year, sometimes more, and it's there that we celebrate what happened in the year past. And so I'm going to give a State of the Church address just briefly. Here's the great stuff that has happened. And we're going to look at where are we going in the future in the coming year, and I'm really excited about that. We had a great year this last year, and we have a wonderful year ahead in the next few years, I think. And we elect officers. We vote on the church's budget, and so anyway, I'm pretty excited about that. And one of the things that I found this week is I wanted to know how much money have we given to missions since we moved into the permanent sanctuary at our Leawood location. And we had said before we built that, we did the calculations to see how much we were spending on that building, and then how much were we going to give in ministries and mission outside the walls of our church over a period of time. And we said in the 20 years after the building was built that we would give 2 times what we spent on the building. And in the 50 years from the time the building was built, it would be something like 7 times, I don't remember the exact number, but 7 times what we spent on the building. And in the 100 years, it was going to be like, I don't know, something like 30 times. I don't remember the numbers. But we looked to see how much have we given just in the last 5 years, and that number is over $35 million that we've given to missions and ministries in the last 5 years. That's about half the cost of the sanctuary itself. There was, architect's fees and what we did in the old foundry, or what's our current foundry, but we're on track to more than double what we spent on the building just in its first 20 years. And this building will be here for, I hope, hundreds of years being used for God's purposes. So anyway, I was pretty excited about that. We gave the numbers, in 2017, but I thought, I hope those are right. And we're finding they are right. And you've had a huge impact. And in the year 2022 in our budget, between our budget and what we give on top of the budget, we're going to give about $9.6 million to missions and ministries beyond the walls of Church of the Resurrection. And that makes me really proud too. All of the rest of what we're giving is making possible ministry that happens within the walls and outside the walls of the church. But, it's all making ministry happen. But I just it struck me that, that's something I'm really proud of. And I hope if you're a part of Resurrection, you'll be proud of that too. All right. So let's talk about cremation. That was one of the questions that people have had. And I met with a man just recently, actually 2 weeks ago. He came to my office and he said, hey, my wife and I are planning about, funeral arrangements and all that. And we hope we have a long time to go. But, she's comfortable with cremation and I'm not really sure about it. What do you think about this? And so I'm glad to have a chance to talk about that. And I want to share with you just a little bit about what the Bible does or doesn't say, and then what Christians have said over the years, and some of my own thinking about this. So the Bible doesn't mention cremation except in one story, and that story is found in 1 Samuel 31, 11 through 13. And what's happened there is that Saul has been the king of Israel, and he has 3 sons, and or maybe more, but I remember the 3. One of which is Jonathan, King David's, the man who will become King David, David's closest friend, dearest friend. And the Philistines end up capturing and killing Saul, King Saul, and also Jonathan and 2 of his brothers. And then they take their bodies and they nail them to the city walls. And so they behead Saul, they nail their bodies as like trophies, nailed to the walls of the city. And the city is Bet Shan. I've actually taken some of you to Bet Shan before. That's beautiful historic ruins there, just about 15 miles south of the Sea of Galilee. So the men of Jabesh Gilead, who were loyal to King Saul and loyal to Israel, they find out about this, and their bravest men go and they retrieve the bodies of Saul and Jonathan and his 2 brothers. And this is the one example of cremation. They take their bodies and they burn them, and then they take the bones and they bury them. And they did this as a way both of addressing the fact that their bodies had probably partially been decomposed. They did this as a way of honoring their king that they loved and the princes that they loved. And so it's interesting. There's this one picture of cremation in the Bible. We don't have any other examples of that, but perhaps there were some, and we just simply don't know about it. Typically, the Jewish people buried, and by the time of Jesus, it was interesting. They would bury someone in a tomb, and they would anoint the body for burial, wrap it in burial cloths, place it in a tomb, and then after decomposition happened, so within a year or 2 years, and all the flesh had decomposed, they would go in and they would take the bones, they would take them apart and wash them, take them apart, and they would put them in an ossuary or a bone box, which was about what was the length of the longest bone, the femur. And they would place the bones in there, and then that way there was more room to be able to have someone else laid out when they died, and to be able to hold numerous of these ossuary. And if you've been to Israel with me, you've seen these boxes because any of the caves right around Jerusalem, you'll find lots of them. And so this was the practice in the time of Jesus. So the Bible knows of cremation. It doesn't talk about it. It doesn't say positive, it doesn't say negative, it doesn't say anything one way or the other about cremation. It does say in the book of Genesis that we came from dust and to dust we will return. That was God's statement about Adam, that he wouldn't live forever. From dust he came and to dust he would return. That's in Genesis, I think it's 3. And so this is what we have, is the idea that our bodies are all temporary. They're going to return to the dust. Now, Paul talks about what happens to our bodies when we die, and then the idea of the resurrection. And he talks about this in 1 Corinthians 15 and in 2 Corinthians, I think it's chapter 4 and 5. So in 1 Corinthians 15, he says this: someone will say, how are the dead raised? So people are asking these questions then too, like, what happens to this body when we put it into the ground, and what will take place? And so how are the dead raised? What kind of body will they have when they come back? Look, fool, when you put a seed, can you believe Paul says that? Look, fool, when you put a seed in the ground, it doesn't have the shape that it will have, but it's a bare grain of wheat or some other seed. There are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies. The heavenly bodies have one kind of glory, and the earthly bodies have another kind of glory. So he's talking about, presumably there, he's talking about, a body that we will have versus the body that we do have that we put into the ground. It's the same with the resurrection of the dead. A rotting body is put into the ground, but what is raised won't ever decay. It is degraded when it's put into the ground, but it's raised in glory. It's weak when it's put into the ground, but it's raised in power. It's a physical body when it's put into the ground, but it's raised as a spiritual body. If there is a physical body, there's also a spiritual body. The nature of the person made of dust is shared by people who are made of dust, and the nature of the heavenly person is shared by heavenly people. We will look like the heavenly person in the same way as we have looked like the person made from dust. This is what I'm saying, brothers and sisters. Flesh and blood can't inherit God's kingdom. Something that rots can't inherit something that doesn't decay. And so he's saying, we're going to put the body into the ground just like a seed. It's going to decay. It returns to the dust from which it came. But you are not just your body. And that's what we talked about last week when it came to near-death experiences, when it comes to the idea of resurrection. You are not simply your body. And so given that, the body goes in the ground, it decays, and yet the consciousness, the soul, goes to be with God and is given a new body. And so Paul says it this way in 2 Corinthians 4:7. And here's the point I ultimately want you to get, is the old body isn't going to be needed by the heavenly body. We don't need to make sure that the old body is perfectly preserved so it can be resurrected and reused and yet transformed. That's not how things work with the afterlife. And so in 2 Corinthians 4:7, Paul describes our body saying this: we have this treasure, meaning our consciousness, our soul, we have this treasure in clay pots, so that the awesome power belongs to God and doesn't come from us. So I want to pause there for just a moment. And when you think of clay pots, if you've ever been to the Holy Land, everywhere you look, you're going to find, if you look carefully in archaeological sites, you're going to find just shards of clay pots. This is actually the lid of a clay pot, and this striations indicates that it may have come from the period of King Herod. This is typical of the lids to the jars at that time. So, clay is scooped up from the earth. It's formed, and then it's fired, and it's used to store grain, or it's used to store other kinds of food or other kinds of things. When it's done, may be able to be washed and reused. If it's not, it's tossed aside. It's just thrown away. And that's why you find these shards everywhere. And so when Paul uses this metaphor, everybody knows this. You toss aside the clay pot when it's done, and it eventually, decomposes back into the earth, and you create, new clay pots out of other clay. And so Paul's saying our body is like this. And if you think of this in terms of a Glad bag or a Tupperware or something, ultimately they're just not meant to last forever. And that's what he's saying when he says we have this treasure in jars of clay. Then you get to chapter 5, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and he says this: we know that if the tent we live in on earth is torn down, we have a building from God. It's a house that isn't handmade, which is eternal and located in heaven. So he shifts metaphors and he describes our body as an earthly tent. And I love that Paul was a tent maker, and he also knew, you take care of your tent, it's going to last quite a while, but it's not meant to last forever. They're going to get ripped and torn, and eventually you're going to throw that tent away, and you're going to have to go buy a new one, which is why he had a job as a tent maker. He could always be making more tents. And so he says, when the earthly tent that we live in is destroyed, we have a building not made by human hands, eternal in the heavens. And so he's describing something very different. Our consciousness, who we are as a person, goes on. And I think even that is transformed at our death. So we talk about being sanctified or being made what we were meant to be. There's a change that happens to us. We're not just the same old people when we get to heaven, but all of the unkindness and the inhumanity or the sinful thoughts or whatever, those are purged away. We become transformed by Christ when we enter his kingdom, and we have a new body, whatever that looks like. And some people have said, well, let's look at Jesus when he was resurrected, whether ours might be like that. And you remember that Jesus appears in different forms. He's able to eat. He has physicality where people can touch him, but at the same time, and in his case, the scars are still marked on his body so that the disciples knew this is the one who was crucified. And at the same time, he's able to walk through locked doors. He shows up in a house where the doors were locked, and there he is, and he shows up in different places. And so there's something that continues with the physicality, but then it's something, a transformed body that's different. Now, that may or may not be what our heavenly bodies are like. But my point is that this old body, I'm not going to need it anymore when I die. And thank God, I'm counting on the fact that, my heavenly body isn't going to struggle with being overweight. It's not going to struggle with losing hair. And it's not going to struggle with, teeth that get a little more crooked the older you get. And, but instead will be a body that's perfect and yet still able to, be known by other people. And some people say, well, what age will you look when you get to heaven? I have no idea. I don't even know if it's going to look quite like that, or if we look more like people of light. I don't know. There's a lot of stuff we don't know. But here's my point. If you're really wrestling with the idea of cremation, the physical body that we have is not something that you have to worry about. And what we know is that buried in the ground, you put a body in the ground without any embalming or anything. So the way it was done for 1900 years during the Christian era, even though the Egyptians, mastered the idea of embalming. But when a body was put in the ground, within 8 or 10 years, within a year or so, there's not much left except for the bones. And 8 to 10 years, depending on the conditions, those bones begin to dissolve as well. Embalming, they could last longer than that, but the purpose of embalming wasn't to keep the body looking the way it does now forever. Sometimes that happens that way, but generally, for a long period of time. But generally, even with embalming, as I was reading, morticians talking about this, that's designed to preserve the body long enough to be able to have the services and then preserve it sometime after that. But again, they're talking somewhere between 10 years and 100 years. And then you find the body is still going to decompose. And so all of those people who died in the last 2,000 years before modern embalming, their bodies ultimately turned back to dust. They were reintegrated into the earth and reabsorbed by plants and other things or bacteria or whatever. And so, this body it's returned to dust. From dust you came, to dust you shall return. That's just what happens to all of us. And I think when it comes to cremation, I'm also reminded of, one of the earliest persecutions of Christians were Nero persecuted Christians, and he took some Christians and he tied them to poles, and then he lit them on fire as entertainment for his dinner guests. And, part of what we read in Revelation is that these martyrs who had died for the sake of Christ are around the throne of God. And so they're dressed in white. And so there seems to be no problem with the people who were burned to death by Nero making their way to heaven and being around the throne of God. And we think about anyone who's died in a terrible fire, or we think about 9/11 and the more than 2,000 people who died in the World Trade Center. What was it, 2,600 people or something who died at the World Trade Center. And nobody questions whether those folks belong to Christ, or whether there was some fear that because they died in 9/11 they didn't make it to heaven. And so what I'd say is this: if you're comfortable being buried in the ground, that's great. That's the way Christians have done this forever. And the Catholic Church was against cremation for a long time, and it partly was because they saw the pagans, some of the pagans, burn their dead. Now the Egyptians buried them. Many of the Romans and Greeks buried them. You can find lots of cemeteries from the time of Christ in the Roman Empire. But some people burned their dead, and so the Catholic Church associated that, and early Christians associated that eventually with something that was pagan. Well, as Christians, that's not nobody who's a Christian would want to be burned, cremated, because they're a pagan. They're just trying to think. So in my case, I plan to be cremated. Partly that's because I really don't like the idea of decomposing the ground, and I kind of like the idea of just being, my body being done with and taking up a very tiny amount of space and not a larger space. And so there's, those kind of things. And I like the idea of being inurned. That's what we call it, not interred. If somebody's buried, but inurned, if they have an urn or their ashes are placed at the church, being inurned at the church. We have a beautiful memorial garden here at our Leawood location. We actually have two of them. And the new one is just behind the sanctuary, our sanctuary. And at night, there's, our stained glass window has Christ with his arms outstretched. And I love this, that at night, if you ever go out there, Christ is looking over that memorial garden with his arms outstretched, the good shepherd, as though he's called these folks to say, I'm the resurrection and the life, and those who believe in me will never die. I like that. I like the fact that there's a water feature out there. I like the fact that I'm in a place where people come to church and then they can stop by and remember their loved ones after church, just like early churches had cemeteries outside of them here in America and certainly in Europe, where people came to church and they were connected still with their friends and their family from their church family. So in the case, we can't have cemeteries here on our site, but we can have the memorial garden, and I just like that idea. I love the idea that my whole family, we've bought a whole row. The church gave Levon and me, for I think the church's 25th anniversary, maybe it was the 30th anniversary, gave us a niche for Levon and me, and then we purchased niches for our kids and our granddaughter, and whether they use them or not, I think my kids probably will and their spouses, but I like the fact that we're connected together there and that people can walk outside and see their loved ones. When I walk through the memorial garden, I love seeing people that I baptized and people that I knew and loved who died, at a very late age in life, and some who tragically died early. But there's something about being out there, and it's a very quiet, peaceful place with the sound of water bubbling up. And so if you're interested in that, contact the church office. We can tell you more about it. I think you can find information on our website. How you can purchase a niche and be a part of that. I think we've sold out the first round of niches, and we built another section, and we have several more sections to build. But there's something about that that's very comforting for me. Levon and I had different views on that ourselves to begin with, and she eventually was like, no, okay, I get it, and I want to do that. I'm not trying to convince you to do that. I'm just saying, I think there's no biblical reason why you wouldn't, be okay with cremation. And certainly I wouldn't do it if I didn't, if I believe that, and that there was. And if you are interested, maybe your church, if you don't go to Resurrection, maybe your church has a memorial garden like that or would consider doing that. But for me, that's just a very comforting thought I have about being with folks, who I loved. Many of our friends are out there in the garden. And when I'm out there with people, they're like, hey, this is our niche over here. And I'm like, hey, we get to be neighbors forever. How cool is that? Which is going to be true in heaven, but also with our natural remains or cremains. And I did joke when the church gave us this niche and said, we want you and Levon to be able to have this niche. And I'm like, that's awesome. This is sort of like the Hotel California. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. So even when I die, I have to stick around here. But the truth is, that's what I was hoping for. That's why we built the Memorial Gardens, is for people to be able to do that. All right, so enough about cremation. By the way, this is a little clay lamp. This is a modern version of what the Israelites used. They put a wick in here and olive oil in here, and they would burn these lamps. And that was another picture of Paul talking about our bodies as a clay pot. And when you're done with this, you just toss it. It has no real value. And but it's the light that comes from it, that has value. And I think that's how our soul and our body is. Our body is important. And by the way, the church also said, we treasure the body. We believe it's a gift from God. It's a temple of the Holy Spirit. So it's not like we're denigrating the body. But at the same time, we believe that the essence that is us continues on, and the physical body we had returns to the dust. So anyway, enough of that. Hopefully that's helpful to some of you who had questions about cremation. I know one of you shared with me your story this week of your daughter and how she was cremated and wanted her ashes spread, and it was just beautiful just to hear what you said about how you felt, in the midst of the pain of losing your daughter, the idea of being able to scatter her ashes and keep some of those ashes, and just to remember that she's returned to God, and she's not in that body anymore. And that's part of what we remember at death and burial, is that body is not ours. And, it's not us. It was part of us, and it's the physical part of us. But when our life leaves the body, it's a clay jar or a clay pot or an earthly tent. And we're grateful for it, and we don't need it anymore.